Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Nathan. I'm a member of the faculty of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and I'm looking at the list of attendees, which is still growing. I see lots of friends, personal friends, and friends of the Institute. So welcome to all of you. Well, we're very excited today to have a presentation by Roger Garside about his very fascinating new book, China Coup. Roger has deep experience with China in several different capacities. He was a member of the British diplomatic service, served in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution, had an impression of what that was like, and served again in China when the transition occurred from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping, and wrote a book at that time, Coming Alive, China After Mao, that was an eyewitness account of this sort of sudden opening up of China in the early Deng Xiaoping years. He also has served after, in and around serving in the British Foreign Service and after the British Foreign Service, in the World Bank and in the banking industry and in the stock exchange industry. He was the official spokesman of the London Stock Exchange for a long time and helped many countries, including advising Chinese policymakers about how to set up stock exchanges. He's retired from these activities now, but he's a sharp observer of things in China. And this book is essentially Roger's assessment of the problems that China faces. We have this notion that China is this behemoth on a sort of unstoppable track to already a peer competitor on an unstoppable pathway toward being the #1 power, perhaps, in the global system, a scary rival to the West in terms of its system and how its system is better than our system and so on. We have that image of China as a leviathan that we're scared of. But Roger has been watching and sees problems that China faces that are informed by his experience in banking and stock exchange work and his knowledge of China. So it's a very deep, very interesting assessment written in an accessible, clear, relatively short format. So it's an important book. And he put in front of this book a fictional narrative of how all of these troubles might come together and lead to a leadership change in China. So that makes it really, really intriguing. And the book's been getting, I think, a lot of attention, although this is only his second webinar. He's done one with the Hoover Institution, but I've seen a lot of mention of it in various media, and I think it's a really important book. So I'm just thrilled to be welcoming Roger to share his views with our audience. Roger will speak and present his views for about 40 minutes. And anytime while he's speaking, you can enter your questions in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your window. There should be one there. And if you'll enter your comments and questions in that, when Roger's done speaking, I'm going to try to select from among those things to pitch questions at him. If I don't know if you have a chat window or button, but if you do, that won't work for us. You have to use the Q&A button in order to put your questions in there at any point while he's speaking. So with that, and we are recording, and with that, I'm happy to hand the microphone, as it were, virtually over to Roger to make his presentation. Hi, Roger. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Andy, for your very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to make this presentation today. And greetings to all of you who've logged into this event. Before I talk about my own book, let me say a word about a far more important book, the Tiananmen Papers, which 20 years ago presented the true story of the Tiananmen massacre through excerpts from 1,000 documents smuggled out of China. I pay tribute to those who smuggled the documents out and to the two men who edited them, Andy Nathan and Perry Link. The editors knew they would pay a heavy price for that work. I salute their courage and their integrity. First slide, please. As I present my book, China Coup, to you, please keep one thing in mind, in the back of your mind. In January 1991, not a single international expert was predicting that the Soviet Union was about to collapse and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to dissolve itself. Yet within 10 months, both had happened. The prevailing view of China today is that the one-party state is strong and stable and will rule China for the foreseeable future. But my book predicts that President Xi Jinping will soon be overthrown by a coup d'etat mounted by rivals in the top leadership, who will end the one-party dictatorship and launch a transition to democracy. I do not predict the collapse of China. How and why will this happen? The first chapter, which is semi-fiction, as Andy said, shows how the coup may happen. The main body of the book, 3/4 of the book, is non-fiction and shows why there will be radical political change in China. The last chapter, semi-fiction again, shows the successors to Xi launching the transition to democracy. In this presentation, I'm going to reverse that order and begin by showing why we should expect political change in China. There are two underlying reasons. First, I see evidence that there's a strong body of people in the Communist Party who believe that the regime under Xi Jinping's leadership is on a course that is disastrous for the party, the nation, and themselves personally. And second, America and its allies are awakening to the threat that this regime now poses to our interests. Contrary to the prevailing view, the regime in China is not strong and stable. The underlying reality is that China's one-party dictatorship is in a state of irreversible political decay. The absence of political reform to accompany economic reform means that the spectacular economic growth has come at great moral, environmental, social, intellectual, and cultural cost. Now the economy itself faces mounting problems, so that an economic drama is being played out in an environment that is toxic. The body politic of China is like a man suffering from an advanced stage of uremia. His kidneys can no longer eliminate urea, which is accumulating in his bloodstream to a level that is now life-threatening. The patient can only be saved by a kidney transplant. So in China, prolongation of the one-party regime is intensifying the nation's problems. The only remedy is a change of political system. Let's be very clear about one supremely important thing. The Chinese state today is not authoritarian, but totalitarian. The eminent historian of Soviet communism, Robert Conquest, described a totalitarian state as one recognizing no limits to its authority in any sphere of public or private life, and which extends that authority to whatever length feasible. My second chapter shows how Xi's China matches this description. The cultural genocide which it is practicing in Xinjiang and the crushing of freedom in Hong Kong are just the latest manifestations of this. A version of totalitarianism practiced by Xi's China is far more subtle and sophisticated than those of either Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. It doesn't rely on mass terror, but is harnessing technologies of control of unprecedented power. Despite this, and despite great economic growth, it does not feel secure. Why? Because it is outwardly strong, but inwardly weak. Next slide. This regime is fearful. It fears democracy. After 70 years in power, it still does not dare to submit itself for re-election by the people in free elections. It suppressed its freedom in Hong Kong because of its fear that the attachment to democracy and the rule of law of 7.5 million Hong Kongers would infect the 1.4 billion inhabitants of the mainland whom it keeps in a condition of slavery, political slavery. It fears truth. The party has always hidden the truth about events of immense importance in the history of its 70-year rule. The cover-up of COVID-19 since in its early stage and the continuing refusal to allow an international inquiry into its origins is a dramatic reminder of its fear of truth. It fears religion. It is alarmed by the explosive growth of all major religions in China since 1979. Alarmed that so many men and women should regard God, not the party, as the supreme authority in the universe. All these factors have combined to create a lack of trust between the regime and the people it rules. Like all totalitarian regimes, it's forced to rely on control, not trust. Since 2011, the budget for internal security has exceeded that for the military. The regime fears internal dissent more than it fears its foreign enemies. My book shows that this totalitarian system has not only produced the array of deep-seated long-term problems for which China is suffering, which I mentioned earlier. The system actually prevents China's rulers from tackling them effectively. My third chapter, The Looming Economic Crisis, shows what I mean. In about 2008, the Communist Party stopped the transition to the market economy, which had produced great economic growth, economic reforms, which had liberated the energy and enterprise of the Chinese people. The same energy and enterprise that had already brought prosperity to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Economic reform had allowed a dynamic private sector to emerge in some areas of the economy. But the commanding heights of banking, telecommunications, power, and transport were kept in the state sector. Why? Not for economic reasons. In China, as in many other countries, many state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are bloated, sclerotic, and loss-making, while the private sector ones are dynamic, innovative, and profitable. But the party feared that to allow private companies to occupy the commanding heights of the economy would destroy its political monopoly. Karl Marx wrote that the political superstructure of the society reflects the economic substructure. The party accepts at least that teaching of his. In other words, it fears that if the private sector grows too strong, it will use its muscle to call the political shots. In practical terms, the party understands that it needs direct control over SOEs as a source of patronage with which to attract and reward its members. So it stopped the transition to the market and will not resume it as long as it maintains the totalitarian political system. This causes other problems for the economy. It requires the state to pump vast amounts of credit into the system to maintain an artificially high growth rate, which keeps people employed in uneconomic activities. According to the IMF, the state sector produces only 22% of GDP, but accounts for 55% of total corporate debt. The debt mountain is enormous. Between 2008 and 2018, the ratio of gross debt to GDP rose from 135% to 300%. No nation with a debt mountain as high as China has ever reduced it without either recession or prolonged inflation. But the party dare not seriously reduce it because it's afraid of causing corporate failures, large-scale unemployment, and the collapse of smaller banks. The combination would cause social unrest. Lacking the legitimacy conferred by free elections, it fears the social and political consequences all that would bring. The financial system is the Achilles heel of the Chinese economy. Major parts of it are vulnerable, especially the shadow banking and property market. China's National Institute of Finance and Development, a government-affiliated think tank, has warned China is currently extremely likely to experience a financial panic. Much of the financial system is opaque and laden with risks. Again, as I stress in my book, the problems of the financial system are caused by the political system. Because the party is determined to retain its monopoly of political power, it keeps loss-making state-owned enterprises alive and forcibly directs a large share of the profits from the private sector to state-owned enterprises through state-owned banks at artificially low interest rates. The only remedy to this, only fundamental remedy to this, is to privatize banks and SOEs, liberate exchange rates to the market forces. But, as I have said, the regime will not do this because that would undermine the one-party state. In the words of Jiang Ming, a political scientist at Renmin University in Beijing, quotes, "Many economic problems that we face are actually political problems in disguise, such as the nature of the economy, the nature of the ownership system in the country, and groups of vested interest," unquote. The next great problem caused by the contradictions inherent in economic reform without political reform is the moral crisis. This nation was once governed by ethics, but now it's in a deep moral crisis. I devote a whole chapter to this, and the chapter is entitled "No Trust, no truth. The existence of this problem is officially recognized. Many people have attested to the moral confusion in China. How could it be otherwise under a totalitarian regime which routinely subordinates truth to its political interests? How could it be otherwise when children are taught by their parents to hide their true thoughts as soon as they begin to socialize or go to school? Such a system makes people doubt whether there is any such thing as truth, independent of needs, desires, and interests. At the heart of this moral crisis lies another problem: corruption. Corruption, you may say, exists in every society, whatever its political system. True. But what distinguishes it in China is that the Communist Party developed it for political reasons and sustains it for political reasons. It is a systemic problem, and the anti-corruption campaign launched by Xi Jinping did not address its systemic causes, only its symptoms. Preposterous? No. After the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, the regime faced an existential crisis. It had forfeited any moral authority it possessed. It had lost the loyalty of its followers. Determined to continue to rule China by a one-party dictatorship, how could it rebuild that loyalty in the face of the greatest movement for democracy and the rule of law the world has ever seen? How could it do that? By preaching Marxism and Leninism? No chance. A hopeless cause. The only effective means was by appealing to the desire to grow rich. So when it embarked on the greatest act of privatization in the history of the world, it did so in such a way that there was no legal clarity about the identity of the new owners. What mattered in the new system was who gained effective control over the assets. Who decided that? Senior officials of the party. They made sure that they and their business cronies gained control. It's all explained in the book, China's Crony Capitalism, by Professor Min-Shin Pei. That was true in the 1990s, and it's true today. In this respect, the Communist Party is no better than a mafia. In this respect, China is ruled by a kleptocracy. Corruption in China is therefore systemic and can only be tackled if there is freedom of expression and an independent judiciary. These are impossible under a totalitarian regime. They require democracy and the rule of law. Like a patient suffering from uremia, China requires a political transplant. China requires a democratic revolution. I mentioned earlier that the regime is alarmed by the explosive growth of all 5 major religions in China. Tens of millions of people have found that material prosperity is not enough. They're searching for the meaning of life. Most alarmingly for the regime, many well-educated, successful people in the Han heartlands of China have turned to Christianity and are attracted by its universal character. There were 4 million baptized Christians in 1949. Today, there's an estimated 60 million. So the regime is persecuting religion to a degree not seen since the death of Mao. its strategy of cultural genocide in Xinjiang and Tibet are the most extreme manifestations. Next problem, the environment. I devote a whole chapter to the environmental catastrophe from which China is suffering. Again, I show in the book that this catastrophe is a product of the political system. Why? Because tolerance by the people of the party's political monopoly depends on economic growth. And so the party gives it priority over the environment. Not only that, effective control over pollution depends in large part on the monitoring and campaigning done by non-governmental organizations. And a totalitarian regime will not tolerate vigorous, autonomous NGOs. It fears any vigorous, autonomous NGO. It suppresses or controls them. Turning to international relations, I show in my book how the global strategy being pursued by Xi Jinping has provoked a sea change towards China's communist regime in the attitudes and policies of the United States and its allies. Lack of trust is not only an internal problem, it also poisons China's international relations. Abroad, as at home, distrust has been dramatically intensified by the cover-up of the origins of COVID-19 and the crackdown on freedom in Hong Kong, especially through the imposition of the national security law. This is part of a wider alienation of the US and its allies. You've heard the reasons before, the litany: rampant espionage, the combination of cyber theft and forced transfer of technology, which has produced the greatest international transfer of intellectual property in history, the bullying rhetoric of wolf warriors, and sanctions on European parliamentarians. Countries which once engaged with China in benign partnership have now become hostile. In January 2013, Xi Jinping defined his party's goal as a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position. A broad and deep international consensus is growing that this regime poses a threat to the world order that the US and its allies have built since 1945. Trust will not be restored until there is a change of political regime in China. The constitutional lawyer, Xu Jinping, wrote in February 2020, the only way for China to end its global and historical isolation and become a meaningful participant in the global system, as well as flourish on the path of national survival and prosperity, is to pursue a politics that embraces constitutional democracy and fosters a true people's republic. There is much evidence that the damage which the political system is doing to China is recognized by many in its ruling elite. I examine this evidence in my book. Here, I will cite only one example. In 2013, the Chinese government and the World Bank published a joint report entitled China 2030. It was a product of the biggest collaboration ever between the Chinese government and the World Bank. It proposed far-reaching reforms for the economy and society. There was, of course, no mention of political reform, but it was quite clear that none of these reforms could be fully implemented without political reform. This was clear to the Chinese who contributed to the study. Who led the input of the Chinese government? Today's Premier, Li Keqiang. I don't suggest that any leaders of the Communist Party have undergone a Damascene conversion to the ideals of liberal democracy. But I am convinced that some have reached a pragmatic recognition of the need for a change of political system. They can also see that, paradoxically, their best hope of defending their own wealth and power is to lead the nation into systemic change. How will this change come? The US and its allies cannot dictate how China is governed, but they can and must help those Chinese who want a democratic China to achieve it. In this, our opponent is not the Chinese people, but the regime which rules them. My book is based on the premise that the US has adopted regime change in China as a strategic goal. Does that shock you? Actually, the US has been pursuing regime change in China ever since 1949. Only the strategies for achieving it have changed. For the first 2 decades, the strategy was military confrontation and political and economic isolation. In 1969, Richard Nixon wrote in Foreign Affairs, "The world cannot be safe until China changes. Thus, our aim, to the extent that we influence events, should be to induce change." In 1971, it was he who initiated the strategy of engagement. Since I conceived my book back in 2016, I've watched as first the US and now its allies have recognized that the strategy of engagement will not induce the change in China that so many from Nixon on have believed it would. There is a growing consensus that the regime in China poses a threat to the world order that the US and its allies have been built since 1945 and must be opposed by a new strategy. In January 2013, Mr. Xi encouraged that trend by defining his party's goal as a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position. There's a growing recognition that the prospect of China becoming the biggest economy in the world under a totalitarian regime armed with advanced technologies of control is a nightmare that we must prevent from becoming a reality. In recent years, recognition has grown in liberal democracies that we cannot defend our interests effectively, let alone achieve political change in China, just by a combination of sanctions to express moral outrage and soft power. That alone, those things are essential, but not sufficient. Military intervention is unthinkable. The strategy which has emerged is based on the simple reality perceived by Xi Jinping himself that the US and its allies enjoy economic superiority over China. China depends upon access to the world's major reserve currencies, the international banking system, the world's deepest capital markets, the world's biggest pools of mobile capital, and the greatest centers of scientific and technological discovery, all of which are controlled by the US and its allies. This gives us the power to create the conditions for change. We must exploit this power in a graduated way that incentivizes change and imposes a price on the present course. Decoupling across the board is neither realistic nor desirable, but we must accept short-run economic costs in order to defend and promote our long-term political and economic interests. The US has made a good start by legislation that will deny access to the US capital markets to companies that fail to disclose to investors financial information required by law, as all Chinese companies fail to do. All Chinese companies listed and traded on US exchanges. And a good start has been made by the US in denying access to US technology for many companies that are linked to the Chinese military. Last week, the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to suspend ratification of its comprehensive agreement on investment with China. And I predict that suspension will not end until there is political change in China. Many of these developments are described in my book. What is new and different in it is the US acts with a new sense of urgency and activism in applying the strategy of reliance upon economic superiority to exploit the points of political and economic vulnerability in Xi's China. The urgency is dictated by the prospect of Xi being reappointed for a further term as General Secretary at the next National Party Congress of the Communist Party. The plotters who carry out the coup in my book are real people in today's leadership. The domestic and international context in which they launched the coup is factual. The storyline is a marriage of prediction and imagination. The coup is triggered by a confrontation with the US. This, in turn, triggers an internal financial and broader economic crisis, which is exploited by Xi's rivals to remove him. The external confrontation is not an accident. It is engineered by the US government. The rest of the story I will allow you to discover for yourselves. Implausible? Incredible? Impossible? Read it before you condemn it. At the very least, it will challenge you to reconsider your preconceived ideas about our shared future with China. And think for yourself, what will determine that future? As you do so, remember that in January 1991, not a single international expert was predicting that within 10 months, the Soviet Union would collapse and its Communist Party would dissolve itself. Thank you.
Roger, thank you. That's a great presentation. I think everybody is clicking on Amazon to buy a copy of the book. I have a copy. I can rent it out to some of you people, but I'm going to set a high price now. We have some very good questions in the Q&A, and I would encourage other people to add their questions to the Q&A, but let me fold in one from my old friend Tom Narins in with a question of my own here. If change is going to happen to China, and after all, China, well, you've given a great assessment of the problems China faces, and also it's true that China has always been changing. So to think that change will happen is pretty plausible, but the form of that change that you've chosen is a coup d'etat from within the party leadership. So why would it be that instead of the party leadership coming together to engineer a reform as it did in the 1980s, or B, a popular uprising as kind of thing that happened in 1989 and has happened on and off in the course of the history of the PRC, or what my friend Tom Narins asks is, why might the breakdown not come instead from the periphery, from the unhappiness in Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia, Hong Kong? So why, out of these kind of four scenarios, top-down reform, popular uprising, collapse from the periphery in, you've picked a coup within the leadership as the most likely way in which these problems will be confronted. Why do you choose that scenario?
Well, political scientists tell us that when dictators are removed from office, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they are removed by members of the elite rather than popular uprising. That's worth bearing in mind. Secondly, why wouldn't the party institute reform? I take it you mean under Xi Jinping. My answer is that Xi Jinping has made the intensification of a totalitarian regime the absolute driving force of his part-time as General Secretary. And it would be contrary to his core convictions. There's no way you're going to quietly persuade Mr. Xi to engage in the reform, such as you mentioned, and such as, and the reform, when we talk about reform, yes, there have been economic reform since 1979, but there's never been political reform. So those in the elite and in the country at large, but the elite, my plotters, who, if they're going to, they start from a position in which they are deeply unhappy about the trajectory in which Xi is leading China. In many cases, he didn't invent the policies which he is pursuing, but he has intensified them. He has held to them long after they have shown much evidence of serious damage to China's interests and posed great risks to the party's interests as well. Just the relationship with the United States is one glaring example of that. So the plotters start from a position where they want regime change. And there's absolutely no point in them taking the enormous risks of plotting against Xi and launching a coup d'etat against Xi just for a change of personnel at the top. If they're going to take those risks, it'll be in order to also change the system. As to change coming from the periphery, I don't see that being a big enough force for change. The periphery has been deeply angered and rebellious for decades. Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan is increasingly alienated from the mainland because of the regime. And Hong Kong, little Hong Kong, deeply alienated. But this techno-totalitarian regime has the power to crush revolt from the periphery. No, if change is going to come, it's got to come from the heartland of China.
Thank you. Now, here's another two-part question. Part of it comes from Tim Yin, who's a grad student. And Tim says, could you go a bit more into detail why you think a coup would result in a reforming or democratic-leaning leadership rather than a more authoritarian one? So if there were a crisis, you might have dissatisfied leaders to the authoritarian right, as it were, of Xi Jinping, who would say, this guy's too soft. They might carry out a coup, but you have the good guys carrying out a coup. So why do you think so? And I would add to that question, if it's the good guys, as you anticipate, who take charge, isn't there a risk of chaos, of exactly of loss of control, which is what Xi Jinping is afraid of? Isn't Xi Jinping right? And we saw that in the 1980s, that when you lighten up a little bit, then all of the dissatisfied elements in society come out of the woodwork and start to challenge. I'm thinking of the meeting that in 1989 Li Peng had with the students, with Uar Kaishi and others.
Yeah.
On a live broadcast, where the students, as soon as you let the students demand something, they start demanding something. And then what? Do you crack down, or do you just allow every part of society? So in other words, would this scenario lead to chaos, or would it lead, as Tim asks, to more authoritarianism?
I don't think it'll necessarily lead to chaos and authoritarianism, because the people who I say I identify as leading this coup are not themselves authoritarian. If we look at the record of Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, Wang Qishan, it leads me to think that they are not authoritarians. They're not populists. I think that the party elite has had a long time to consider these choices and questions. There was a time when, and you'd know this better than me, Andy, the Central Party School commissioned studies to consider different ways of democratizing the party. I don't believe that the thoughts stopped there. They commissioned studies on what went wrong. Why did the Soviet Union, after dissolving its Communist Party, become authoritarian and chaotic? I think a lot of very serious thought has been given in China to the risks of systemic political change. Which is not to say it couldn't go the wrong way, but I assert that it will not. 1989. I see it a little differently from the way you describe it. There were several weeks during the 89 democracy movement before the massacre when the authority of the Communist Party really was in abeyance. The police went off the street in Beijing. What happened? The amount of crime went down. There was not chaos and anarchy and rebellion all over China. In major city after major city, there were orderly demonstrations for democracy and the rule of law. I think that the Chinese people have an innate fear of disorder and love of order. I lived in Hong Kong in the 50s and the 60s, and it was a time of small government. And the civic order, the good behavior of people in society in very harsh conditions. I mean, in the 50s, Hong Kong was not yet a very prosperous place. Even in the 60s, there were many people living on the hillsides or in very rudimentary housing blocks. And yet their social conduct and their sense of civic order was more impressive than I've seen it in any country in the world. It wasn't anything to do with moralistic teaching or civics in school under British orders. It was, I think, a manifestation of something that goes deep in Chinese society. So those would be some of my thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Let me put together two questions from Frank Kale and Charles Kimball, which have to do with the Belt and Road Initiative and China's external debt. So Frank says about China's Belt and Road Initiative, is it, according to your analysis, a form of neo-imperialism? Or is it a creative international economic development program, or both, perhaps, depending on the partner country? And then Charles asks, if most low-income countries which are debtors to China would default, could that trigger domestic Chinese default? So this builds on your expertise in finance, whether or not and I want to come back, I want to ask a little bit more about your expertise in finance, because you've been in banking and you've been in the stock administration of stock markets.
Yeah.
And you emphasize in your book the debt load in China, but this is a question more about the international. Could the debt load in China be kind of triggered by the defaults in certain Belt and Road countries where they can't service their debt, and then so that's Charles' question, and then Frank's question about the Belt and Road: is it a good thing or a bad thing? Is it neo-imperialism, or is it a good international development program?
Nice questions. I'm not sure that I've studied them with sufficient detail to pronounce confidently the answers. I would make this comment about the BRI and the international bank which China has created. And I say this as someone who did work at the World Bank for 3 years. At the World Bank, we had very rigorous procedures for the awarding of contracts. There was a lot of transparency regulations and bidding regulations, etc. Now, from what I read about the BRI, that is not the case with it, that the award of contracts is opaque, there is corruption. And in some cases, the debt clauses, absolutely crucial. Debt clauses, the debt implications for the receiving countries are not published. They're not here. So those are the criticisms that I would make of those programs. And they're not, we shouldn't be surprised, because after all, as I emphasized in my talk, there's a lack of transparency in the financial markets inside China. There's a lack of transparency in the ownership of enterprises. Why should we expect that this regime would behave any differently when it goes overseas than it does at home? As to the impact of debt defaults by countries on China's own financial stability, I'm sorry, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, and I can't gauge the extent of that impact. But certainly it's building up political trouble for China.
I want to ask a little more about finance, which is always a mystery to me. So the SOEs are deeply indebted to Chinese banks. Chinese banks are owned by the Chinese government. Chinese government prints the renminbi that it lends through the banks to the SOEs. The renminbi is not freely convertible on the capital market. So what's to worry? That you can go on forever like that. It's more or less what the United States does. Why should there be a financial crisis?
I think the vulnerability comes not so much on that mechanism, on the side of that mechanism which you've described, but on the side of shadow banking, because of the state's rigid controls over interest rates and the lack of market mechanisms in finance, private sector companies who see their profits being siphoned off to support the indebted SOEs through the state banking system, those private companies have to turn elsewhere to finance their own development. So what happens? Shadow banking has developed. And shadow banking in any economy it lives in the shadows. And the regulators don't have the full facts about it. And risks build up inside that sphere, which can lead to contagion in the financial markets when times of trouble come. We know that the property market is heavily indebted, and it's a very unsound structure. So on the one hand, you have these vulnerabilities in the financial system. On the other, you have, through the sustaining of uneconomic activities, loss-making SOEs, through the state-owned banks, you have a lot of activity building up in society, in the economy, which is unprofitable, which is uneconomic. The return on investment since 2008 in China, in the state-owned sector, has rapidly declined. There's a lot of uneconomic activity taking place in China. It was one of your economists, Herb Stein, who said that things can't go on forever. At some point, things that are wrong just stop.
Okay, I have to unmute myself. Pursuing on banking, China has, at Columbia, we have a master's program in financial technology, and 99.9% of the students in that program are from China, it seems. And they go back, and China is in advance of the rest of the world in fintech.
Yeah.
Chinese people, when they see actual money in New York City, they think that we're in the 18th century over here. And China has announced something called the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System, which of course I do not understand at all. But I've read that it is part of a process of internationalizing the renminbi, that it can be used in international trade to displace the dollar. How do you understand this trajectory, displacing the dollar, advancing fintech, making China less vulnerable to what you say in your book would be a US sort of financial attack that would trigger the coup? How should we interpret all of those complexities?
Well, I think this digital currency, first of all, is a great control mechanism inside China. But as to it enabling the renminbi to supplant the dollar, no way. For an international reserve currency, and I think you alluded to this yourself earlier, has to be freely tradable. Otherwise, people are not going to put their reserves into that currency, whether it's put on the market by the Communist Party of China or some ultra-liberal government somewhere else. And if it's not freely tradable, they're not going to put their reserves into it. So this is another example of the political system inhibiting the development of the economic or the achievement of economic goals.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to convey two questions from the Q&A that have to do with political risk. Albert Goldson asked, what event would represent the tripwire to initiate a coup, perhaps just prior to or during an invasion attempt of Taiwan, he asks. And Jim Dingman says, does Mr. Garside think that we're in a dangerous period vis-a-vis China that could break out into a world war?
Well, let me take the second part of that first, the second question first. I think that Xi Jinping, whose judgment on international affairs doesn't fill me with enormous respect and confidence, nevertheless has a firm grasp of the superiority of military might in the hands of the US and its allies. You've only got to look at the figures for broad headline figures, but he has acknowledged that in speeches to the Politburo and others. But he has developed, China has, under his leadership, developed an extremely strong position in the region of Taiwan, such as might lead him to believe that he could use force to unify Taiwan with the mainland. But that would require, amongst other things, a much weaker US government than you have, and a demonstration of disloyalty in advance to Taiwan, such as I think it is totally out of the question in the foreseeable future. I think that tension across the Taiwan Straits is a very important and deliberate part of Xi Jinping's strategy for mobilizing chauvinistic nationalism to support the regime in the absence of ideological loyalty and in the absence of trust. But I think I don't rate very high the probability of him proceeding to an invasion of Taiwan. You can get miscalculations on the ground, at the local level, which can lead to armed engagements. And there's always a possibility of miscalculation there. And that's an element in my plot. Now, coming back to the other question about political risk and the tripwire. Well, again, I don't want to give away too much of the plot in my book, but let us say that the confrontation between the US and China, which is engineered by the US, has to do with the financial markets. It starts in the financial markets. One of the things which makes that plausible, I think, is that trouble spreads through financial markets at the speed of light. And what begins as a financial crisis can rapidly become an economic crisis and can generate popular revolt. When depositors see the doors of the banks close, they get very angry. They gather in their thousands on the streets, and there can be conflagration. I'll say no more.
Okay. Well, but that's intriguing. You have the United States being smarter than it really is in this scenario. I mean, that the U.S. would have the guts and the astuteness to carry out this kind of an edge shot on another regime and knock it over. The United States has never done that. We were just a bunch of clunkheads. We just go in, and make a mess. So aren't you on this part of your scenario kind of exaggerating the, we bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade by mistake.
Yes, I remember that.
That was us. And the Chinese said, you can't be that dumb. You must have done it on purpose. But actually, we were that dumb. So I want to ask, so that's a funny way of putting this question, but I suppose the serious version of this question is, do you really think, do you really think that even Mike Pompeo, if he got to be elected president, would be so anti-China that he would actually launch, not to mention smart or dumb, but does the US government, even under our most anti-China politicians, really want to overthrow the Chinese government and give rise? You have a hopeful scenario, but a policymaker will know that all kinds of things could happen. Do we want to destabilize the world scene? Does the United States really want to destabilize the world scene to that extent? If it could?
No, certainly they wouldn't want to destabilize the world scene to that extent. I was very careful to say at the start of my presentation that the coup does not lead to chaos in China. It doesn't lead to the collapse of the Chinese authority government. It is a coup engineered by people within the elite and carried out with skill within the elite. But I also said, and I stressed this in my presentation, that the US has been looking for change in China ever since 1949, political change in China. And it has changed its strategies for moving in that direction, for, as Nixon said, inducing change. There's greater urgency now than ever before because of China's hugely increased power and because of its great ambitions, its magnified ambitions under Xi Jinping. There is a China threat now, such as we have never faced before. And this has led the US already to adopt measures it's never adopted before towards China. The legislation in Congress to force your regulators to suspend Chinese companies which don't within 3 years comply with financial disclosure sets a time limit for a confrontation in the capital markets. Under Trump, 300 companies have been listed on the entities list. Measures have been taken against Huawei internationally. These are dramatic measures of using economic power to incentivize change. There are 4 Chinese banks middle-ranking banks, I think, which are subject to suits going through the legal system in the US for breaking sanctions on North Korea. They've not yet reached a judgment, a final judgment. They're ongoing. But if the legal process finds that they are guilty of having broken the sanctions, the US Treasury will most certainly suspend those banks from using the international banking system. That will be a major signal of resolve of the United States to use economic power. And it won't just be for technical financial causes. Why would we not want to prevent this scenario of the largest economy in the world, of China becoming the largest economy in the world under a totalitarian dictatorship armed with advanced technologies of frightening reach? Why would we want to sit back passively, preaching the rule of law, sanctioning half a dozen individuals in Xinjiang, stopping buying cotton, but continuing to pour money through Goldman Sachs into whatever industries? Are we that stupid? Are we that passive? We're living in a new world, Andy. We're living in a new world. And what I'm trying to say in this book is wake up and use the power you have. We have.
I wish you hadn't asked, are we that stupid? But let me interrogate you a little bit further about China becoming number one. Because in your book, you say, and in your presentation today, you said that, I think you said that I forget exactly how you put it, but you talk about China getting stuck in the middle income trap. And I guess actually one of my questions is, how does that work? Again, because you've been in the real world in banking and stuff, and how does that middle income trap work? But then just as a matter of exposition, how that works. But then should we, there are quite a few people who kind of count on the middle income trap and China's population decline and China's water troubles and China's environmental troubles and ... all of these troubles to prevent China from becoming the number one economy in the world. Certainly, even if it exceeded the United States by a little bit, its per capita income would always be stuck in a middle income, and its military is growing, but it has so many enemies. Even domestic, it puts so much of military effort on domestic repression, as you said. I mean, not the formal PLA, but still security budgets.
Yes.
What do you think about those people who say, don't worry so much about China because China's wrapped up in all of its own problems, is never going to really be such a threat?
I accept that China is not going to overtake the US in per capita income in the foreseeable future. But even if its economy keeps growing by 4% a year instead of 6-7% a year, it is likely to become the largest economy in the world. And we have, with substantial resources for putting into military, into the military. And I think and substantial economic power for using in economic coercion on other countries. Yes, the demographic figures look bad, but this is playing out over a period of time. I don't think that China is going to get out of the middle income trap. And it is certainly the case that no country, no autocratic country, no country under an authoritarian, let alone totalitarian regime, has achieved high income status except ones with oil, and China doesn't have oil. So I accept that it's probably going to remain a middle income country, but of such a size that a highly centralized regime can mobilize resources to be very dangerous.
All right. I have a question in the Q&A. What impact will China's role in the pandemic have on its trajectory?
Right. Well, I think we've already seen a very strong impact. Pew Research into the state of opinion about China in dozens of countries shows that the initial cover-up of the pandemic and the continuing refusal to allow an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19 has hugely damaged China's standing in the world, which has not been compensated for by its use of its big government levers to minimize the spread of COVID-19 inside its borders. That's just something that we observe in the Pew Research, and I don't see much change coming out of that.
Thank you. Here's a question from Roy Sturgeon, which I would like to piggyback a question of mine onto. So Roy says, there's a precedent in the PRC for an intra-party CCP coup. In 1978, economic reformer Deng Xiaoping skillfully orchestrated the removal of Mao's last hand-picked successor / lackey, Hua Guofeng. No chaos or country collapse ensued. So that would support your optimism. But my question, coming from the skeptical side, because this good comment from Roy triggers a comparison between Hua Guofeng and Xi Jinping. They're quite different. Because Hua Guofeng was a nobody from the provinces and Mao put him in, but Hua Guofeng had no network. He had no, leaving aside that he had no prestige and no authority, the point I want to emphasize is he had no network. Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with his own people who were loyal to him since middle school, since Shanghai, since Fujian, since he's picked up people along his career who are very much his people. He has completely changed the leadership of the Central Military Commission, which Hua Guofeng never did. He didn't move a single person. Xi Jinping has, as I understand it, and you may know better whether this is true or not, controls the palace guard as Mao did. Mao had his loyalist Wang Dongxing in charge of the Basan Siyao troop.
Yeah.
That provided all of the guards for everybody else. So if you wanted, if I think under Xi Jinping, if Li Keqiang wants to have a meeting with Wang Yang, their guards, sorry about that, their guards and their secretaries are going to report that to Xi Jinping right away. So how does, so the comparison, so it's true that there was a coup, it wasn't really a coup, but there was a very smooth replacement of Hua Guofeng by the old guard. But what do you think about Xi Jinping's coup-proofing arrangements that would, make him invulnerable?
Well, sitting here in South London, I do not claim to have intimate knowledge of all of that, but I would say that a few observations. I mean, Wang Dongxing was a long time loyal servant of Mao Zedong. Yet, when the arrest of the Gang of Four was plotted or carried out, I believe Wang Dongxing collaborated. He didn't lead a resistance against it. He didn't die in the Zhongnanhai in order to save the Gang of Four. So loyalty, political loyalties in China, fascinating question. I mean, if you've been at school with Xi Jinping, worked with him in Shanghai, and he offers you promotion, you take it. But how loyal are you really to him? How deeply does Xi Jinping know what you think? I mean, China, and this has been true throughout the decades that I've gone back and forth, China is a nation of actors, of people who pretend to believe something. They are taught from primary school onwards to adopt the new line and parrot it with apparent conviction. I remember visiting a primary school in a country district in China in 1977 and 76 or 77. Anyway, at the time when the Gang of Four were riding high and Deng Xiaoping was being denounced. And the little, the young primary school children bounded onto the stage singing, "Da da, Deng Xiaoping, strike down Deng Xiaoping." 6 months later, I went back to the same primary school and the same kids were bounding onto the stage and singing "Down with the Gang of Four." Da da, Sir Emba. And with apparent conviction both times. So I think networks in China are of limited utility.
Thank you, Roger. Well, we've reached the end of our time. It's exactly 1:30. So thank you so much. Been a very interesting discussion. And if we had a open Zoom thing, everybody could raise their hands and clap, but I'll do that on behalf of the audience. Thank you very much, Roger, and good luck with this book. I think it'll get a lot of attention and elicit a great deal of interesting discussion.
Well, thank you, and thank you to everybody for their very stimulating questions. This has been a great hour and a half for me.
Great. Thank you. And we'll all sign off now. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.